So, imagine stepping onto a brightly lit stage. It's September of 1893.
Right.
You are in Chicago, standing at the podium of the world's Parliament of Religions. And you look out at this massive audience of the Western world's elite. I mean, thousands of people packed into an auditorium from pit to dome.
Just a completely overwhelming environment.
Exactly. And you are a relatively unknown monk from India. You have no formal institutional backing. Your funds are nearly depleted. And you're about to address a Gilded Age society that, honestly, largely views your entire culture as a primitive, colonized curiosity.
Yeah, that was the prevailing attitude.
But then, within minutes of opening your mouth, you completely shatter their worldview. Today, we're opening up a stack of historical sources, brittle newspaper clippings, transcribed speeches, personal reflections about a man who did exactly that.
Swami Vivekananda.
Yes, we are examining his impact and how the American media of the late 19th century experienced an absolute paradigm shift just trying to cover him.
The historical footprint of this moment really cannot be overstated. We are looking at a profound collision of cultures, documented in real time by journalists who had just never encountered anything like him.
Never.
Because the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, it was designed to showcase the pinnacle of Western industrial and cultural achievement.
Right.
And the Parliament of Religions was supposed to be the spiritual equivalent of that. A grand display of theological evolution, which, in the minds of the organizers, naturally culminated in Western traditions.
Of course.
But Vivekananda completely inverted that expectation.
He really did. But before we plunge into those primary sources, I want to humbly welcome you to the Simplified Summary Channel's Deep Dive. If you're the kind of person who appreciates gaining thorough, historically grounded knowledge, without the overwhelming info overload someone who wants the complete picture stripped of the fluff, please consider subscribing and sharing this audio.
It really helps us out.
It does. Our mission today is to act as your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. We are focusing heavily on excerpts from the complete works of Swami Vivekananda, specifically Volume 3, which covers the reports in American newspapers.
Right, the actual media coverage.
Exactly. We're going to analyze the exact words printed in papers like the Boston Herald, the Washington Post, and the Brooklyn Daily Eagle to see how the West reacted to this Eastern philosopher.
And to fully appreciate the sheer shock value recorded in those reports, we really have to establish the psychological landscape of 1893 America.
Yeah, paint that picture for us.
Well, the introduction to his works frames this moment brilliantly as a clash of two mind floods. On one side, you have the Western mind. It's tumultuous, energetic, hyper-focused on material progress.
The Industrial Revolution is booming.
Exactly. Rapid expansion of industry and a very specific dogmatic view of salvation. It was a culture defined entirely by forward momentum and outward expansion.
And meeting that outward expansion, you have this ocean of Eastern thought, embodied by Vivekananda, a mindset that is calm, ancient, and just steeped in thousands of years of introspective spiritual development dating back to the Vedas.
Yeah.
The organizers of the parliament likely expected a quaint display of foreign traditions, a museum exhibit, basically. But what they got was a mirror held up to their own intellectual limitations. He didn't just walk up to the podium and offer a polite diplomatic greeting. He challenged the very premise of how these different global religions were interacting.
He really targeted the foundational vocabulary of the event itself. In his opening addresses, he drew a sharp surgical distinction between the concept of tolerance and the concept of universal acceptance.
Okay, let's unpack this because that is a critical distinction that still resonates today. In the West, particularly in modern liberal democracies, tolerance is held up as the highest civic virtue. We pride ourselves on being tolerant.
We do.
But Vivekananda pointed out the inherent arrogance embedded in that word. Tolerance implies a hierarchy.
It does.
It silently communicates, I possess the absolute truth, and I know your beliefs are fundamentally flawed, but I will graciously permit you to exist in my society.
It's a posture of superiority masked as grace.
Exactly.
And he explicitly stated that he was proud to belong to a religion that rejects mere tolerance in favor of accepting all religions as true. The source material captures this beautiful, sweeping metaphor he used.
Oh, the bouquet.
Yes. He described Hinduism as a tradition that gathers all religions, from the lowest fetishism to the highest absolutism, and binds them with the cord of love into a bouquet of worship.
A bouquet of worship. That is such a striking image. He was introducing a framework of pluralism that was light years ahead of the theological debates happening in Chicago at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
You can just imagine the 19th century theologians sitting in that room, processing that,
Oh.
because they were steeped in rigid doctrines of exclusivity, the idea that there is only one narrow path to salvation and everything else is damnation.
And he knew that. So a few days later, on September 15th, he steps back up to the podium to address this systemic rigidity. And he does it not with dense theological jargon, but with a deceptively simple story.
The frog.
He tells the audience about a frog that lived its entire life in a small well.
It is a brilliant rhetorical maneuver. He bypasses their theological defenses entirely using a fable.
Right.
He describes this fat, sleek little frog who spent its days clearing the worms and bacilli out of its well water, completely content. And one day, another frog falls into this well.
On the sea.
Right. The well frog asks the newcomer where he's from. The newcomer replies, "I am from the sea." The well frog, having never conceived of anything beyond his brick walls, asks, "The sea, how big is that?
Yeah.
Is it as big as my well?"
And he takes a little leap from one side of the well to the other.
Exactly.
And the absurdity of the comparison is exactly the point he's making to the audience. The sea frog naturally laughs and explains that you cannot compare the vastness of the sea to a tiny well.
But the well frog cannot process this data. It violates his entire reality. He takes a larger leap, asks again, and is rebuffed again. Finally, the well frog's worldview crystallizes into pure denial.
He just shucks down.
He declares, "Nothing can be bigger than my well. This fellow's a liar. Turn him out."
And then Vivekananda looks out at this gathering of global religious leaders, the most powerful theologians in the Western world, and delivers the punchline.
He says, "I am Hindu. I am sitting in my own little well and thinking that the whole world is my little well. The Christian sits in his little well and thinks the whole world is his well. The Mohammedan sits in his little well and thinks that is the whole world."
The genius of that moment lies in its diagnostic precision. He was diagnosing sectarianism and bigotry not as a moral failing, but as an epistemological one.
A failure of imagination.
A failure of imagination and scale. Sectarianism, which he rightfully noted had drenched the earth in human blood and destroyed civilizations, it stems from the well frog's delusion that its immediate, limited environment constitutes the entirety of existence.
He was challenging the audience to recognize the artificial boundaries of their own intellectual wells.
And he didn't just leave them with a diagnosis of their limitations. He offered a completely radical paradigm shift for how to view human spiritual development.
Yes, the climbing metaphor.
He introduced the idea that humanity is not traveling from error to truth, but climbing up from truth to truth, from truth that is lower to truth that is higher.
That is a monumental philosophical pivot, because the prevailing 19th century Western view, and frankly a view still dominant today, operates on a strict binary.
True or false.
Exactly. Beliefs are either true or false. If you belong to a different faith or hold a different philosophical view, you are in error. And if you are in error, you must be corrected, converted, or conquered.
Vivekananda's evolutionary view of spiritual growth just dismantles that aggressive binary.
Because if you view someone else's belief not as a damnable error, but as a lower truth, a necessary stepping stone on the exact same mountain you are climbing, your entire response mechanisms change.
Empathy replaces hostility.
Assistance replaces conquest. You recognize that the well frog isn't evil. It simply hasn't seen the ocean yet. And crucially, you recognize that your own current understanding might just be a slightly larger well.
This profound reframing of human intellectual and spiritual history hit that Chicago audience like a thunderbolt. The newspapers recognized immediately that they were dealing with an intellect of staggering proportions.
And the resulting media coverage reveals a fascinating level of cognitive dissonance as the Gilded Age press tried to process, package, and sometimes defend against this Eastern philosopher.
The press reaction is really the absolute core of our deep dive today.
It is. When we look at Volume 3, the reports in the American newspapers, we see an incredible mixture of intense awe, exoticization, and genuine intellectual engagement.
Let's look at how they initially covered his visual and auditory impact, because the sheer sensory shock of his presence dominated the early headlines.
Right. Papers like the Morning Herald and the Saginaw Courier-Herald devoted paragraphs just to his aesthetic.
And we must contextualize this within the demographics of the 1890s United States. The country was overwhelmingly white, Protestant, and highly insulated from the daily realities of Eastern cultures.
Very insular.
Most Americans' understanding of India was filtered exclusively through the highly biased reports of British colonial administrators or Christian missionaries, and they often emphasized poverty and exoticism to justify their presence.
So when Vivekananda arrived, he was a visual anomaly.
Totally.
The reporters fixated on his attire. They described the yellow turban, the vibrant red robe tied with the sash, his swarthy skin, and his pearly white teeth. There's a distinct element of spectacle in the reporting, almost like they are describing a theatrical performer rather than a philosopher.
But the visual exoticism immediately gave way to absolute astonishment the moment he spoke.
Because he shattered the colonial stereotype of the uneducated passive Easterner.
Exactly. He addressed them with absolute fluency in their own cultural and linguistic vernacular.
The Saginaw Courier-Herald specifically noted his pure and grammatically constructed English sentences. Another paper, the Northampton Daily Herald, praised his delivery as silver-tongued, noting a slight, highly musical foreign accent.
It wasn't just that he spoke English, it was that he commanded the language with a rhetorical sophistication that rivaled or exceeded the best Western orators of the day.
Furthermore, the Baltimore Sun captured a crucial detail about his stage presence that fascinated the press. They reported on an event where he shared the stage with several other prominent speakers.
Right.
The journalist noted how Vivekananda sat with imperturbable stolidity until it was his turn to approach the podium. He didn't fidget, he didn't seek the crowd's attention, he didn't perform the typical anxious rituals of a public speaker.
That immense grounded calmness was magnetic. The reports consistently mentioned theaters being packed from pit to dome, with up to 3,000 people gathering just to hear him speak.
But this massive platform wasn't used for pleasantries or diplomatic flattery. The primary sources reveal a man who was utterly fearless in his sociological critiques. He held up that mirror we talked about, and he forced the American press to look at the ugliest aspects of their own society.
And this is where the historical record becomes incredibly compelling. A typical foreign dignitary in 1893 would praise the industrial might of the United States, flatter the hosts, maybe humbly ask for trade or aid.
Play the game.
Right. Vivekananda did the exact opposite. He scrutinized the moral foundation of the Gilded Age.
The Bay City Daily Tribune published an interview that is just staggering in its bluntness. The reporter asks for his impressions of America, and Vivekananda replies, "This is a great land, but I wouldn't like to live here. Americans think too much of money."
Wow.
He essentially diagnoses the United States as a dollar-worshipping society.
Yeah.
He goes on to tell the reporter, "Your people have much to learn. When your nation is as old as ours, you will be wiser."
That is a breathtaking reversal of the typical colonial dynamic. For centuries, the West had assumed the role of the mature, advanced civilization evaluating the primitive East.
And here is an Indian monk standing amidst the soaring skyscrapers and massive wealth of 1890s America, looking at their hypercapitalism and calmly stating that they are spiritually immature.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, his critique extended far beyond economics. He tackled the most glaring hypocrisy of the American experiment.
Racial segregation.
Yes. The Saginaw Courier-Herald reported on his travels through the American South. He observed the realities of Jim Crow laws firsthand.
He detailed to the press how Black Americans were barred from hotels and forbidden from riding in the same train cars as white men. He laid bare the stark contradiction of a nation that loudly proclaimed itself the beacon of liberty and advanced civilization while systematically subjugating an entire demographic of human beings.
And the media's reaction to this moral audit was highly defensive. They were entirely unaccustomed to being the subject of anthropological scrutiny by a non-Westerner.
A telling interaction occurred with a reporter from the Courier-Herald. After hearing these critiques, the journalist asked Vivekananda if he was officially investigating American institutions.
As if he was a formal inspector.
Right. And Vivekananda replied simply, "No, I am a preacher only."
The journalist's conclusion to that interaction is so revealing. The reporter wrote that Vivekananda's answer displayed both a want of curiosity and narrowness.
It's incredible. The journalist couldn't conceptualize that Vivekananda didn't view American civic institutions as the pinnacle of human achievement worthy of academic study.
The reporter mistook Vivekananda's spiritual focus for ignorance. To the 19th century American mind, their institutions were the ultimate truth. To Vivekananda, they were just another well, and a rather flawed one at that.
This cultural friction generated real heat when the press covered the topic of Christian missionaries. The newspapers documented a fascinating and highly charged debate when Vivekananda appeared with the Vrooman brothers in Baltimore to discuss what they termed dynamic religion.
We have to remember the economic and cultural engine of the missionary movement at this time. Sending missionaries to India to convert the populace was a massive philanthropic, financial, and theological priority for Western churches.
It was viewed as the ultimate act of civilizational charity.
But according to the Baltimore American and the Sun, Vivekananda completely dismantled the underlying logic of that enterprise. His approach was devastatingly pragmatic.
He told the audience that sending missionaries to India to preach theology is entirely redundant. He said India has bushels full of doctrines and to spare.
What India lacked in the late 19th century wasn't religion, it was basic material sustenance.
He told the press that his people needed means, money, and bread. The papers quoted his core rallying cry, "Less doctrine, more bread."
It is a profound critique of misplaced priorities. He was exposing the absurdity of prioritizing theological conversion over physical survival. He argued that true religion is not merely intellectual assent to a dogma. It is practical philanthropy.
He stated, "Prayer with the hands is yet higher than prayer with the lips. Doing good is life, contraction is death."
He was directly challenging the immense material wealth of the West to manifest in a truly spiritual way by alleviating physical suffering rather than exporting theology to a culture that had been producing profound theology for millennia.
As you read through the newspaper archives, you watch the journalists wrestle with this logic. They're clearly captivated by him, but their deeply ingrained cultural biases force them into defensive postures.
The Northampton Daily Herald provides a perfect case study of this media dissonance.
It really does. The writer spends the first half of the article praising Vivekananda, calling him a learned Hindu nobleman and highlighting his brilliance. But then the psychological defense mechanisms kick in.
How does the paper attempt to neutralize his argument?
Well, the journalist writes that when Vivekananda attempts to prove that the self-centered, self-cultivating, preeminently self-soul-saving, negative and passive, not to say selfishly indolent religion of his race, is superior to the vitally aggressive, self-forgetful, do-good unto others religion, which we call Christianity, he is attempting a large contract.
The word choices there are a masterclass in 19th century Western self-perception, selfishly indolent versus vitally aggressive.
It perfectly encapsulates the clash of the mind floods. The Western journalist equates aggression, constant outward expansion, and proselytization with vitality and moral goodness.
Because Eastern philosophy prioritizes internal mastery, contemplation, and the realization of the self, the Western mind categorizes it as passive, negative, and lazy.
The journalist completely misses Vivekananda's point. India didn't need more vitally aggressive philosophy. It needed the practical material organization that the West possessed to solve a physical crisis.
Vivekananda was advocating for a synthesis. He recognized that the West possessed an incredible genius for physical organization and social action, while the East possessed an unparalleled depth of introspective spiritual science.
But the tragedy of the media coverage is watching the journalists consistently default to a zero-sum game, assuming that to validate his Eastern philosophy would require invalidating their Western identity.
Which naturally led the press to aggressively interrogate him about the controversies surrounding Indian social customs. The American media was relentless in demanding that he answer for the perceived barbarism of his homeland.
When we look at the reports from the Brooklyn Standard Union and the Daily Eagle, we see Vivekananda forced to mount a vigorous defense of his culture.
And we need to keep in mind that the Western fascination with Indian social customs in the 1890s was largely manufactured and amplified by the missionary complex.
To justify the funding.
Exactly. To justify the massive fundraising required to send missions to India, it was necessary to portray the native population as desperately in need of moral salvation. Specific social customs were frequently sensationalized in Western literature and pulpits to paint a picture of total societal darkness.
So the press zeroed in on three main targets: the treatment of child widows, the institution of child marriage, and the cultural myth of the Juggernaut.
And it's important to pause here and clarify what that last term actually meant in this historical context. Because today, Juggernaut just means an unstoppable force. But in 1893, it was a highly specific piece of anti-Indian propaganda.
What was the origin of it?
The Juggernaut refers to the Ratha Yatra festival in Puri, India, where massive, heavy temple cars carrying the deities of Juggernaut are pulled by thousands of devotees. Early British colonial observers and later missionaries sent back sensationalized reports claiming that fanatic Hindus were intentionally throwing themselves under the massive wheels to be crushed to death as a form of human sacrifice. It became a powerful, gruesome metaphor in the West for blind, destructive religious fanaticism.
So the Brooklyn reporters throw these accusations at him. They demand to know about the widows, the child brides, and the suicidal fanatics of the Juggernaut. And Vivekananda's response is a masterclass in rhetorical dismantling.
First, he addresses the Juggernaut directly.
He explains that the sensationalized reports of mass, intentional suicides are largely colonial myths. He points out that pushing those massive carts through dense crowds of hundreds of thousands of people occasionally results in tragic accidents, much like deadly accidents happened in crowded Western industrial cities. But it was absolutely not a systemic religious practice of human sacrifice.
He was attacking the journalistic integrity of the colonial narratives that the American public had swallowed whole.
He used the same strategy regarding the status of widows. He flatly denied the systemic, institutionalized abuse being reported in the West. He challenged their legal assumptions, pointing out to the press that Indian law actually guaranteed widows their own property before marriage and the property of their deceased husbands.
Which was a level of financial independence many Western women in the 1890s did not possess.
Right. And as a reminder to you listening, our role here isn't to validate or invalidate the sociology of 19th century India, but simply to report objectively on the arguments Vivekananda made in these historical texts.
Exactly. He argued that widows seldom remarried not due to brutal enforcement, but because of complex demographic realities, including a scarcity of men.
And regarding child marriage, he went beyond legal defense to challenge the fundamental premise of cultural imperialism. He pointed out that the West was evaluating Indian social structures using exclusively Western metrics, without making any effort to understand the internal logic, historical context, or complex kinship networks that sustained those customs.
He argued that the custom was deemed bad by the press simply because it deviated from the Western norm.
But what makes his defense truly remarkable is that he didn't just play defense against the American press. He aimed his most blistering critiques at his own countrymen who capitulated to this Western gaze.
He openly scorned the foreign-educated Hindus who traveled to the West, absorbed the colonial narratives, and returned to India full of champagne and new ideas, only to abuse their own heritage to appease their colonizers.
He was identifying the psychological toll of imperialism, how a conquered people begin to view themselves through the contemptuous eyes of their conquerors.
He recognized that foreigners frequently amplified the evils of Indian society, specifically to cover up the glaring moral failures of their own societies.
Pure projection. And this precise dynamic leads Vivekananda to articulate what I consider to be one of the most profound sociological frameworks in the entire historical record. We can call it the apple tree analogy. It is a fundamental rule for how we must engage in cross-cultural analysis.
It is a stunning piece of rhetoric. He delivered this to the audience in Brooklyn.
He said to them, "The product of the slums of any nation cannot be the criterion of our judgment of that nation. One may collect the rotten, worm-eaten apples under every apple tree in the world and write a book about each of them and still know nothing of the beauty and possibilities of the apple tree. Only in the highest and best can we judge a nation. The fallen are a race by themselves."
The profundity of that statement lies in its universal application. If you want to understand the true nature of the United States, you cannot simply document the highest crime rates in the most impoverished systemic slums, compile that data, and declare, "This is America." That is a distortion.
And conversely, if you want to judge India, you cannot isolate its extreme poverty, the tragic misapplications of its customs, or the sensationalized accounts of accidents and declare, "This is India."
To understand any culture, you are required to examine its highest ideals, its most beautiful art, its deepest philosophies.
You have to look at the beauty and the possibilities of the apple tree itself, rather than obsessively photographing the rotten fruit that has fallen to the dirt.
It is a direct challenge to the sensationalist media of his time, and frankly, a vital warning for our current media consumption. It forces us to ask, are we building our worldviews based on carefully curated collections of worm-eaten apples?
Are we judging other cultures, other political affiliations, or other generations entirely by their slums, while demanding that they judge us by our highest ideals?
This requires a massive intellectual shift, and Vivekananda didn't just want to debate sociology or correct journalistic malpractice. He was fundamentally a teacher, and his ultimate goal was to introduce the West to the actual philosophical architecture of Vedanta. He wanted to explain the science of the soul and the mind.
And this is where his genius for translation shines. He understood that to reach the 19th century American intellect, he could not simply recite ancient Sanskrit verses. He had to translate Eastern mysticism into the prevailing language of the West, the language of empirical science.
We see this immediately in how he redefined the very concept of religion for the press.
Because to a 19th century American, a religion is inextricably linked to a specific historical book, the Bible. A religion is a text handed down at a specific point in time.
But Vivekananda told the reporters that the Vedas, the foundational texts of Hinduism, are not books in that sense. He defined them as an accumulated treasury of spiritual laws.
He deliberately invoked the language of physics. He compared spiritual laws to the law of gravity.
He pointed out that gravity existed long before Isaac Newton discovered it. The mechanics of the universe were functioning perfectly before humanity had a word for them.
Similarly, he argued, the moral, ethical, and spiritual laws that govern consciousness exist independently of humanity. The ancient sages didn't invent these laws. They simply discovered them, just as a physicist discovers a natural law.
By framing religion this way, he strips away the dogmatic, historical, and tribal baggage that usually accompanies theological discussion. If spiritual laws are akin to physical laws, they are universal, eternal, and most importantly, subject to verification through direct experience.
It moves religion from the realm of blind belief into the realm of science. Here's where it gets really interesting. Vivekananda bypassed traditional theology entirely and went straight to the first law of thermodynamics to explain one of the most difficult concepts for the Western mind to grasp: reincarnation.
The Ada Record published a meticulous account of how he walked the American audience through this logic. He utilized the law of conservation of energy,
which states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be transformed from one state to another.
Applying this hard scientific principle to consciousness, Vivekananda argued that the idea of creation, the theological concept of God making a soul out of absolutely nothing at the moment of birth, is scientifically impossible.
Something cannot come from nothing. Therefore, creation and the creator must be parallel lines without beginning or end. God does not arbitrarily conjure a soul into existence. And if the soul was not created at the moment of physical birth, deductive logic dictates that it must have a past.
He used this scientific foundation to address the ultimate philosophical dilemma, the problem of suffering and inequality.
He posed a devastating question to the press. Why is one person born into abject misery, lacking health or wealth, while another is born into happiness, prosperity, and vitality?
If a perfectly just and merciful God is creating these souls out of nothing at the moment of birth, why is he acting with such arbitrary cruelty?
The traditional theological answers simply don't hold up to logical scrutiny. But, Vivekananda explained, if you apply the universal law of cause and effect, what Eastern philosophy calls karma, the universe instantly makes sense.
Present conditions are the direct result of past actions. The soul is carrying the momentum of its previous existence.
The standard Western and scientifically minded rebuttal to this in the late 19th century, which was the era of rising Darwinian thought, was that heredity explains our tendencies. We inherit our physical and psychological traits from our parents, not from past lives.
But he anticipated that argument completely. He told the reporters that heredity only explains the physical configuration. Genetics provides the instrument, the hardware.
But the soul itself carries specific tendencies or software from its past actions. By the laws of affinity, a soul with a certain tendency gravitates toward a physical body determined by heredity that is the fittest instrument to display that specific tendency.
It is a brilliant synthesis of Darwinian physical evolution and Eastern spiritual evolution.
But this complex framework inevitably prompts the most common journalistic follow-up question. If I have lived countless past lives, why do I have absolutely no memory of them?
His answer to this is incredibly elegant. The texts record him using the analogy of language to explain the mechanics of memory.
He said to the audience, I'm speaking English now. No words of my mother tongue are present in my consciousness right now. But if I try to bring them up, they rush in.
He is differentiating between active consciousness and subconscious storage.
He describes our daily waking consciousness as merely the surface of the mental ocean. We live our lives riding the waves on the very top layer. But within the dark, silent depths of that ocean, every single past experience, every tendency, every lifetime is stored.
The reason we don't remember our past lives isn't because they didn't happen. It's simply because we haven't trained ourselves to dive deep enough beneath the surface of the mental ocean to retrieve the data.
And this naturally brings the conversation to the methodologies required to actually dive into that ocean. How does one access those depths?
The Western press was deeply suspicious of Eastern mental and physical practices, frequently conflating genuine spiritual discipline with carnival magic and parlor tricks.
The newspapers dubbed this the Yogis versus Jugglers debate. The American public was hungry for tales of the supernatural, and the Washington Post actively pressed him about miraculous performances, specifically mind reading.
And the source text includes a genuinely wild anecdote regarding this that Vivekananda shared with the press.
It highlights the exact friction between sensationalism and actual spiritual science. The story goes that Vivekananda and a group of friends went to observe a man who publicly claimed to be able to read minds.
To test him, they wrote specific questions on pieces of paper and hid them in their pockets.
The man successfully answered the hidden questions. But then the man raised the stakes. He asked Vivekananda to think of a sentence in any language he chose. Vivekananda, testing the absolute limits of the man's ability, thought of a long, complex sentence in Sanskrit. The man had already written it down perfectly.
Another friend in the group thought of a specific sentence in Arabic from the Quran. The man had written that down as well.
From a Western journalistic perspective, this is an impossible feat of clairvoyance, proof of supernatural magic.
But the fascinating part of that report is how Vivekananda contextualized the event. He didn't deny that the mind reading occurred, but he categorically refused to classify it as a miracle.
He sharply differentiated between these performers, whom he called jugglers, and true spiritual practitioners. He told the reporter that he had zero interest in miracles. He pointed out that there was a massive lack of trained, scientific, and unprejudiced observers regarding these mental phenomena.
He was aggressively demystifying the mysticism. He was arguing that these abilities are not supernatural gifts bestowed by deities, nor are they spooky magic tricks. They are simply the result of a highly specific, scientific, and trained approach to the human mind.
He explained to the press that in India, the practice of intense breath control and extreme mental concentration isn't a circus act. It is the religion.
It is a daily, rigorous, private discipline aimed at realizing the divine nature of the self.
True yogis do not perform on stages. They don't do the famous mango trick for an audience. They use these scientific methods of concentration to achieve spiritual liberation, not to entertain journalists.
He was demanding that the West elevate its understanding of the human mind. He wanted them to recognize the immense, untapped power of disciplined concentration, not as a novelty, but as the ultimate tool for human evolution.
Once he demystified these mental practices and stripped away the aura of magic, it naturally begged a much larger question for the American press. If this isn't about parlor tricks, and if it isn't about converting people to a new dogma, what is the ultimate endgame of this philosophy?
What kind of human being is Vedanta actually trying to build?
This brings us to the grand synthesis of his message. He wasn't just deconstructing Western materialism or defending Eastern customs. He was proposing a new model for human existence that merged the strengths of both hemispheres.
He encapsulated this vision using a phrase that perfectly defines the idealized, modernized global citizen. He stated that the ultimate goal is to possess the intellect of Shankara with the heart of Buddha.
To understand the weight of that statement, we must look at the historical figures he referenced. Adi Shankara was an 8th century Indian philosopher, renowned as one of the most brilliant minds in history. He was a master of razor-sharp logic, debate, and the non-dualistic philosophy of Advaita Vedanta.
He represents the absolute pinnacle of uncompromising intellectual rigor.
Buddha, conversely, represents the ultimate manifestation of boundless, self-sacrificing compassion and empathy for all living beings.
Vivekananda diagnosed the global imbalance. He saw the West as having developed immense intellectual, scientific, and organizational power, a sort of industrial intellect, but heavily lacking in spiritual depth and universal compassion.
Conversely, he saw the East as possessing deep spiritual insight and the heart of the Buddha, but severely lacking the active, material organization required to alleviate actual physical suffering.
His entire mission was to forge a human being who combined the relentless logic and active energy of the intellect with the boundless empathy of the heart.
And he provided a highly practical framework for how one achieves this synthesis in daily life. He rejected the notion that spiritual purity requires isolating oneself from society.
He utilized a classic image from Eastern thought, the simile of the lotus leaf.
He told the American audiences that they must learn to live in the world like a lotus leaf. The leaf grows in the water. It is entirely surrounded by water. It depends on the water, but it is never moistened by it. The water simply rolls off its surface.
He told them, live with your hands to work and your hearts to God.
It is a total rejection of extreme asceticism as the only path to salvation. He was telling the Gilded Age titans of industry, the journalists, and the citizens that they did not need to flee to a cave in the Himalayas to be true yogis.
A person can be standing on the chaotic trading floor of the Chicago Board of Trade, deeply engaged in the commerce of the world, and still be a yogi, provided they maintain the internal non-attachment of the lotus leaf.
He expanded on this by teaching what he called the secret of work. The secret is to pay as much attention to the means of work as to the end result.
In the West, we are obsessively focused on the goal, the profit, the endpoint. We sacrifice our peace of mind for the outcome.
Vivekananda argued that if you perfect the means, if your daily actions are pure, focused, and unattached to personal ego, the end will naturally take care of itself. The spiritual practice is in the action itself, not in the reward.
This raises an important question. If we look at the geopolitical landscape of the late 19th century through this philosophical lens, India possessed this majestic universal philosophy of the lotus leaf and the science of the soul. Yet, politically and materially, India was a subjugated nation ruled by the British Empire.
How did Vivekananda reconcile the spiritual supremacy of his homeland with its harsh political reality on the global stage?
He addressed this paradox by presenting a breathtakingly grand view of human history. He argued that India's conquests are never military, they are entirely spiritual.
Our source texts document him explaining a historical pattern to the press. He argued that whenever a great conquering race, whether it was the ancient Greeks under Alexander the Great or the vast British Empire in the 19th century, links the world together with roads, trade routes, and infrastructure, it inadvertently creates a massive circulatory system for human thought.
The empire builds the physical infrastructure, but it cannot control the ideas that travel along it.
Precisely. He said that whenever the world is linked politically or commercially by an empire, India unconsciously rises up and pours forth her gifts of spirituality to balance the world's progress.
The conquerors build the telegraph lines, the railways, and the steamship routes for commerce and control. But India's ancient wisdom uses those exact same channels to flood the world, restoring a spiritual equilibrium to a humanity that has become dangerously imbalanced by materialism.
To lend academic weight to this historical theory, he quoted the renowned German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Decades earlier, after reading some of the first Western translations of the Upanishads, Schopenhauer had predicted that the world was on the verge of a revolution in thought, driven entirely by Indian philosophy.
Schopenhauer called it the most beneficial and elevating study in the world.
And when you look back at Vivekananda's statements in 1893, from our vantage point today, his prediction of a spiritual deluge was incredibly prophetic. The British Empire built the steamships that allowed a monk without institutional backing to cross the ocean and stand in Chicago. And what is the result of that initial channel being opened?
The result is entirely visible in modern Western culture. The foundational concepts he introduced, mindfulness, the physical and mental disciplines of yoga, the idea of spiritual laws independent of dogma, have been thoroughly integrated into Western medicine, corporate culture, psychology, and daily life.
The spiritual deluge he described is not a historical theory. It is a present reality.
It forces us to examine our current moment. In our modern, hyper-connected world, the physical infrastructure of empire has been replaced by the digital infrastructure of the internet and social media.
The globe has never been more linked. Are we currently experiencing another wave of this deluge? Are these ancient introspective ideas rising up again, specifically to balance out our overwhelming technological obsession?
It seems almost a sociological necessity. The more our minds are fractured by constant digital distraction, algorithmic manipulation, and the anxieties of the modern world, the more intense the craving becomes for the very concentration-based stabilizing practices that Vivekananda introduced to that Chicago audience.
Synthesizing everything we've unpacked from these remarkable primary sources, it becomes undeniably clear that Swami Vivekananda's 1893 visit to America was not merely a historical curiosity or a brief media sensation. It was a profound, multidimensional challenge to the entire global order.
He challenged the apathy of the East, urging his own culture to abandon archaic superstitions and embrace the active material philanthropy of the West to prioritize bread alongside doctrine.
Simultaneously, he held a massive mirror up to the West, exposing its materialism, its racial hypocrisies, and its aggressive sectarianism. He demanded a new kind of human being, one who synthesized the organizational genius of the West with the deep introspective spiritual laws of the East.
He was fundamentally demanding that humanity climb out of its isolated wells.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we conclude. Vivekananda warned the elite minds of 1893 against the well frog mentality, the arrogant delusion of sitting in our own tiny domains, observing our limited experiences, and declaring that we have comprehended the entire universe.
In his time, those walls were constructed from rigid religious dogmas, colonial biases, and geographic isolation. Today, our wells are digital. They are our algorithmic echo
A
chambers.
chillingly accurate parallel. We are the frogs in the algorithmic well.
We curate our social media feeds to reflect only what we already believe. We block dissenting voices, surround ourselves with our own opinions, and convince ourselves that our highly tailored digital well is the totality of the real world.
If a modernized Vivekananda were to address us right now, standing on the infinite stage of the internet, looking at our hyper-fragmented, anxious societies, what kind of vast sea would he ask us to jump into to finally see the horizon? What specific shock to our system would it take for us to recognize that we are not the possessors of absolute truth, but merely climbers, making our way from lower truths to higher truths?
That is a question that requires the intellect of Shankara and the heart of Buddha to answer.
It certainly does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the 1893 culture clash and the monumental impact of Swami Vivekananda. A final reminder, if you valued this extensive unpacking of history and philosophy without the superficial fluff, please hit the subscribe button for the Simplified Summary channel and share this audio with anyone who possesses a genuine hunger for knowledge. Keep questioning the boundaries of your well, keep engaging with the primary sources, and keep climbing from truth to truth.